At exactly 3:47 GMT, the transmission came through. A war declaration from the Corinthian hegemony. Earth had no time to process. The warning systems in place were too slow, too outdated. By the time the message reached Earth's diplomatic channels, the Corinthian Armada had already arrived. 10,000 ships, black and monolithic, appearing like a wave of death at the edge of the Sol system. Admiral Jax Torren watched the monitors as the first salvo came in. His heart sank, but his mind remained sharp. His eyes flicked over the data, a brutal assault on Mars colony and 3 orbital habitats. The first blast was enough to wipe 12 million people off the map, their lives snuffed out in an instant. The Corinthians were ruthless. A warrior culture bred for dominance, they had conquered 17 species in their history. Humanity, in their eyes, was no more than a fragile, weak species, a species of pacifists, easy to eradicate with the first show of force. They had no idea who they were dealing with. On the flagship, the USS Vanguard, Torren's orders came quickly and decisively. The deck shook as the ship's shields, only partially raised, absorbed the brunt of the incoming fire. The quantum comms array, a recent experimental technology, hummed with activity, its sensors picking up the attack milliseconds before the impact. 0.3 seconds, just enough time for Torren to act. The ship lurched to the left, barely avoiding the full force of the plasma barrage. "Shields up! Full power to the engines!" Torren barked, gripping the edge of his command chair. His eyes were locked on the screen, watching as the Vanguard's hull groaned under the strain. Every ship in Earth's Third Fleet had been on high alert for years, but they were never prepared for this. The Corinthians, it seemed, had decided that humanity was no longer a concern. That was their mistake. Torren's fingers flew over the console, activating the experimental quantum communications technology, an upgrade that had been tested but never used in combat. He'd fought for this moment, for years. The quantum comms array connected to a network of satellites scattered around Earth's orbit. It wasn't just for sending messages, it was built to detect anomalies, disruptions and threats on an interstellar scale. Now, it was the only reason Torren was still alive. As he watched the Corinthian ships enter their formation, Torren felt a cold anger rise in him. The Zorathi attack had almost destroyed humanity before. This time, he wouldn't let that happen again. They'd come for Earth, thinking they could crush the human spirit with a single blow. But Torren wasn't just any admiral. He wasn't the leader of a fleet on paper. He was the only one who saw through the illusion of humanity's defense. The Corinthians had been too confident, too arrogant. They didn't know the truth about Earth's military capabilities. Earth's military might was a carefully curated illusion. For years, humanity's governments had put forth a public defense fleet designed to deter enemies, sure, but not to fight an all-out war. The real work, the true preparation for conflict, was kept under wraps. It wasn't part of the public defense doctrine. Humanity's real military project had been the Odin Initiative, a secret program focused on developing cutting-edge weapons and systems to protect Earth from the impossible. Torren had been at the head of that initiative, a visionary project that the Federation had never understood. They thought the Odin Initiative was just a theoretical project. They were wrong. Now, as Torren's fleet retreated, trying to regain order from the chaos of the attack, he could only think of one thing: outsmarting the Corinthians. They had underestimated humanity, thinking Earth's defense systems were little more than a facade. But Torren knew better. As his flagship raced toward a nearby orbital station, he realized that the Corinthians had made one fatal mistake. They thought humanity was weak. They didn't know about the true weapons Earth had been preparing. The first blast from the Corinthian Armada had shattered the Mars colony in a brutal show of force. Torren saw the flash on his screen as the colony went dark, a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 12 million lives were gone, wiped from existence in a heartbeat. The orbital habitats fared no better. Ships, civilian and military, were nothing more than trinkets to the Corinthians, who crushed them effortlessly with plasma fire. There was no mercy, no warning. It was a message, a declaration of war that was designed to break humanity before the real fight even began. But the Corinthians didn't understand the human spirit. Torren had always known the stakes were high, but he'd never believed it would come to this. The Corinthians had attacked Earth's solar system without hesitation. Their Armada, an intimidating sight to anyone who'd never seen it before, now hovered above the remains of Mars. Their ships, designed for devastation, were enormous, powerful, and seemingly unstoppable. As the Vanguard shuddered from another direct hit, Torren finally turned his attention to the console. He had already ordered a full retreat, pulling the remaining fleet back to pre-designated coordinates behind the moon. It wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. The Corinthians were overconfident. They believed Earth's fleets were all that humanity had to offer. What they didn't know was that Torren's secret weapon was already in play. "Initiating protocol Ragnarok," Torren muttered, his voice a low growl. The retreat had begun. As the Vanguard made its jump, Torren couldn't help but think back to the years of work, of hidden programs, of a fleet that had been a lie. What the Corinthians didn't know was that Earth wasn't the weak, defenseless species they had believed. They had underestimated humanity for the last time, and now Torren was going to show them what happens when a species that's been left for dead refuses to stay down. The Corinthians had fired first, but humanity was about to strike back in a way they never imagined. The Corinthian Armada hadn't just attacked Earth. They had announced the beginning of a war, an assault meant to break humanity once and for all. But there was a faint glimmer of hope. Torren wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when humanity's future hung in the balance. Admiral Jax Torren stood at the helm of the UNSS Vanguard, his flagship, as the sound of explosions and chaos reverberated through the ship's command deck. He had just ordered the retreat, a move that felt as much like an act of cowardice as it was a strategic maneuver. Protocol Ragnarok, the plan humanity had secretly put in place for a day like today. Retreat to the hidden sanctuaries behind the moon, where Earth's secret weapons were buried in the craters and asteroid fields. But the Corinthians, their warrior culture, wouldn't let them escape so easily. The Vanguard systems flared as it pushed through the wreckage of humanity's first line of defense. The Corinthian Armada, relentless and unforgiving, pursued, their fleet advancing faster than Torren could anticipate. The enemy ships were massive, crushing, unstoppable. Torren's heart pounded. Every minute counted. He had to believe that the secret weapons humanity had spent years perfecting were enough to turn the tide. He had to trust in the Odin Initiative. It was humanity's true defense, a secret program meant to tip the balance when everything else failed. The rest of the fleet, following Torren's orders, fell back behind the moon's shadow, taking refuge where the Corinthians couldn't see them. "Activate all platforms." Torren's voice was cold, but his mind was alive with calculations, strategies, and the urgency of their survival. As Earth's remaining ships retreated, they were covered by hidden railguns, platforms buried deep within asteroid fields and hidden craters. These weapons had never been tested against an enemy like the Corinthians. Torren had always hoped they'd never need to. Earth's planetary defense system was a network of hidden power. Railgun platforms armed with the most advanced weaponry Earth had. These were the real weapons humanity had spent decades preparing. While the Corinthians believed humanity had no chance, they had underestimated one crucial thing: humanity's creativity and ingenuity. These railguns, built into the moon and asteroid fields, were capable of devastating precision. When Torren gave the order, the weapon systems activated, sending a devastating barrage into the Corinthian fleet. For a moment, the Corinthians were caught off guard. 30% of their fleet was crippled in the first strike. Ships exploded, their defenses shredded by Earth's railguns, sending massive fragments careening through the vacuum. The Corinthian ships began to falter, drifting out of formation as chaos spread throughout their ranks. Humanity had struck back with precision, targeting the gaps in the Corinthians' defensive grid. But the Corinthians weren't fools. Their superior point defense systems quickly adapted, and within minutes they began intercepting the next volley, their ships quickly regrouping and retaliating. Torren watched as their ships closed in, using their energy shields to absorb the hits while their massive plasma cannons launched attacks of their own. The tide had only shifted momentarily. Torren gritted his teeth as the communications officer reported incoming damage to their own forces. Humanity's counterattack had caused a brief shift, but the Corinthians were not beaten yet. "We need more time," Torren muttered, his fingers clenched around the console as he calculated their next move. The Corinthian response was swift and brutal. Their ships formed a relentless pursuit pattern, closing in on Earth's position. Massive energy pulses lit up the deep black of space as they retaliated, their guns tearing through Earth's defenses. It wasn't enough. Torren knew it wouldn't be. The Corinthians didn't understand humanity's true nature. They thought their attack would wipe Earth out completely, but humanity was still fighting. As the Corinthians retaliated, Torren felt a quiet shift within him. His job had always been to lead humanity's forces, but this moment was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about outsmarting the enemy, about using strategy over brute force. "Get me Dr. Voss, now!" Torren barked. Dr. Ren Voss, his chief science officer, was the one person Torren trusted with the delicate secrets of the Odin Initiative. Minutes later, Dr. Voss's face appeared on the screen. His voice was calm, but tinged with urgency. "Admiral, the Corinthian fleets are starting to adapt. But I believe I've found a vulnerability. Their ships share a common quantum signature in their navigation systems." Torren leaned forward, listening intently. This was the breakthrough they needed. "Explain!" "That rely on instantaneous, faster-than-light FTL communication between their fleet. Their navigation systems, while effective, leave traces, quantum residuals that are vulnerable to disruption. We can exploit this, but we'll need to get close to their command vessel." Torren's mind raced. A weakness, finally. Humanity had the tools, the knowledge. They weren't just defending anymore, they were fighting back, with intelligence and calculation. "We'll send in the last battleship, the UNSS Vengeance," Torren said firmly, "and you'll have your opportunity." In the aftermath of the battle, the Corinthians were shaken. Earth had fought back, and for the first time, they realized the true danger they faced. Torren and his fleet had bought time, and for the Corinthians, it was only a matter of time before they felt the true cost of underestimating humanity. The hidden platforms, humanity's railguns, had struck back and broken the illusion of human fragility. Earth was no longer seen as a fragile species ready to fall. The world had just begun its true fight. Now Torren knew they were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting to take back their future. The galaxy had thought humanity could be crushed, but Earth had already begun to show that their true strength lay not in military might, but in the ability to adapt, to turn the tables, to outwit even the most advanced enemies. The Zorathi didn't understand humanity's potential. Now, neither did the Corinthians. Humanity wasn't done yet. And the Corinthians were about to learn the hard way what happens when you attack a species that fights not just with weapons, but with its mind. Admiral Jax Torren stood on the bridge of the UNSS Vanguard, his eyes fixed on the holographic displays showing the Corinthian fleet closing in on Earth. The latest attack had been brutal, but Earth had struck back with everything it had, and now the Corinthians were regrouping, preparing for another assault. The situation had reached a critical point. Humanity's military might had been exposed, and now it was a matter of survival. But in that silence, in the midst of an ongoing war, a whisper of hope had just surfaced. Dr. Ren Voss, Torren's science officer, had been working tirelessly on quantum systems, the same technology that the Corinthians had used to coordinate their fleets. Torren had always trusted Voss's expertise, but it was only now that the scientist's breakthrough had the potential to change everything. "Admiral, I believe I've found a flaw." Dr. Voss's voice broke through the tense silence, drawing Torren's attention. He turned to face the screen where Voss's hologram appeared, looking fatigued but determined. The scientist had been poring over data from the Corinthian fleet's communication systems, their fleet's quantum navigation systems. They rely on a specific type of instantaneous FTL communication to keep all their ships in perfect synchronization. The issue is, it leaves a residue, a trace of quantum fluctuation in their system. We can track it, and more importantly, we can disrupt it. Torren's heart skipped a beat as the full weight of the discovery settled in. This was the key. The Corinthian fleet, so organized, so precise, relied on this quantum network for everything. Their navigation, their tactical coordination, their communications. But if that network could be hacked, if Earth could disrupt it, the entire fleet could fall into disarray. "Can we do it?" Torren asked, his voice low, almost urgent. Voss didn't hesitate. "Yes, but it's dangerous. If we're going to exploit this, we need to get close enough to their flagship, within 10,000 kilometers. There's no way to do this without putting our last operational battleship directly in their line of fire. The risk, it's enormous. We're talking about a suicide mission." For a moment, Torren stood motionless, processing the gravity of the situation. Suicide mission. It was a term he had hoped he would never have to utter. The UNSS Vengeance was the last battleship Earth had at its disposal, but it was barely operational after the previous battle. Sending it to infiltrate the Corinthian flagship was insane. But it was also the only way to ensure a chance at victory. "I'll lead the mission." Torren's voice was firm, his decision already made. Voss stared at him, surprised. "Admiral, with all due respect," Voss started, but Torren cut him off. "No. I'll lead the mission. This is what we've been preparing for. We can't afford to wait any longer. I'm not asking for your approval, I'm giving the order." Torren's gaze locked with Voss's, his words leaving no room for doubt. The scientist's shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded in understanding. "Understood, Admiral." Voss said quietly, his voice resigned. The UNSS Vengeance wasn't the ship it had been at the start of the war. It had taken critical damage, and now its hull was a patchwork of repairs barely holding together. But it was humanity's last hope. Torren gathered the last of his officers and engineers, preparing them for what they all knew was a one-way mission. The crew was ready, but their faces were grim. They understood what was at stake. As the Vengeance made its way toward the Corinthian flagship, Torren couldn't help but think about the Odin Initiative, the secret project that had been humanity's silent defense against the impossible. The railgun platforms, the quantum communication tech, the relativistic kill vehicles, all of it had been designed to prepare Earth for this kind of fight. But none of it would matter if the Corinthian quantum network wasn't disrupted. Torren leaned back in his chair as the Vengeance closed in, the Corinthian flagship looming ahead. It felt like an eternity. The ship shuddered with every blast from the enemy fleet, but they kept moving forward, inching closer to the danger zone. If they could make it, even just a little further, they would have their shot. But there was no room for error. "Almost there. Hold tight." Torren's voice was calm, but inside his mind raced. Every second counted. Then came the moment. The Vengeance was within range. The flashes of plasma fire lit up the void as Corinthian ships turned their fire toward them, but it didn't matter. Torren gave the order. "Now!" The crew knew what to do. The quantum virus that Voss had engineered was uploaded to the Vengeance's comm system, a simple but effective program designed to disrupt the Corinthians' quantum network. For a moment there was nothing. Then, the Corinthian flagship's communication signals flickered. Their systems blinked erratically as the virus spread, infecting the entire fleet's systems. Their navigation, their coordination, their tactical network all began to collapse. Ships that had once been perfectly synchronized now found themselves drifting out of formation. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Torren watched in stunned silence as the Corinthian fleet descended into chaos. The flagship, once a symbol of their invincibility, was now a sitting target. The damage was done. The Vengeance had achieved its goal. The Vengeance continued its assault, using every last ounce of power to strike the Corinthian ships. But the damage was already done. The Corinthian fleet was in disarray. Torren could see it. This was it. This was their chance. "Fire the railguns!" Torren commanded. Earth's remaining fleet launched a devastating barrage, and for the first time since the war began, the Corinthians were caught off guard. Their shields failed. Their ships collided. Panic set in. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Torren stood at the helm, watching as the battle unfolded. It was hard to believe how far humanity had come. How one virus, one desperate move, had turned the tide. But he knew this was only the beginning. The Corinthians, once invincible, were falling apart, and humanity was finally fighting back. The UNSS Vengeance shuddered violently as another barrage of Corinthian plasma struck its outer hull. Torren gripped the console with white knuckles, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the ship's broken frame straining beneath him, the weight of the mission pressing down on his shoulders. The suicide run was no longer just a calculated risk. It was now the only chance humanity had. His crew, though battered and bruised, had done their part. The virus was successfully uploaded to the Corinthian fleet's communication network, causing chaos within their ranks. Torren looked at the holographic display in front of him. The Corinthian flagship looming ahead was still operational, despite the chaos. Their quantum network was collapsing and their ships were falling apart, but their flagship, the heart of their Armada, was still fighting back. It wasn't enough. He couldn't let it continue. Torren made a decision. "Prepare for ramming speed." His voice was steady, his command unshaken. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a brief moment his crew froze. They knew what it meant. They knew what he was about to do. "Admiral, no!" The voice of his second-in-command, Lieutenant Sarah Delgado, crackled over the comms. "You're talking about a full-on collision. We don't have the power to survive that impact." Torren didn't hesitate. "We don't need to survive." He turned his gaze to the stars outside the viewport. The Vengeance was a ship on borrowed time, its systems failing one by one. But it had one last purpose to fulfill. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about delivering the final blow to the Corinthian fleet and taking their flagship down. "I'm doing this. Get ready for the worst." He cut off the comms and then, turning toward the forward console, he ordered his crew to reroute power from the failing systems into the engines. There wasn't much time. They were already within striking distance of the Corinthian flagship, a massive warship that towered over the surrounding ships like an unshakable monument. But Torren wasn't afraid. He wasn't scared of death, not anymore. Humanity's fight for survival had led them here. Now, it was time to end this. The Vengeance rumbled as its engines roared to life, its remaining power thrusting it forward at a breakneck speed. The Corinthian flagship was within sight now, its sleek, intimidating form bearing down on Earth's crippled ship. Torren's hand tightened on the command lever, the ship's hull groaning as it accelerated toward its target. Outside the viewport, the world seemed to slow down. The endless void of space seemed to stretch before him as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to change, for something monumental to occur. The Vengeance trembled, its hull straining under the intense forces Torren was subjecting it to. But there was no turning back now. There were no second chances. If this failed, humanity would fall. With the flagship rapidly closing the gap, Torren gave the final order. "Full power to the engines." The impact came like a violent thunderclap, the Vengeance's hull slamming into the Corinthian flagship with a sickening screech of metal grinding against metal. The force of the collision sent shockwaves through both ships. The Vengeance shuddered, its internal structure collapsing in on itself. But it didn't matter. Torren had made his decision. The Corinthian flagship's spine cracked with a horrific noise. For a split second, time seemed to stop. The Corinthian admiral, towering over his command deck, looked on in disbelief as his flagship buckled under the force of the impact. The once proud vessel was now a wounded beast, its systems collapsing as the ship buckled inward. Torren had succeeded. He had delivered the blow, broken their line, and torn their forces apart. But it wasn't over yet. Through the ship's failing comms, Torren's voice crackled across the galaxy, echoing through the chaos. The words, simple yet weighty, carried the weight of humanity's defiance, its struggle, and its survival. Never again. The transmission was a final declaration, a message to the entire Corinthian hegemony and the galaxy at large. Humanity would not be broken. Torren's voice, though strained with the weight of the situation, rang out with a finality that resonated across the cosmos. The Corinthian flagship shuddered, its hull splitting, its systems imploding under the immense damage. The entire fleet, still caught in the chaos of the quantum disruption, was now utterly disoriented. Ships spun out of control, and the once unshakable force was now reduced to nothing more than drifting wreckage. As the Vengeance crumpled around him, Torren's final orders were clear. He had completed his mission. He had broken the Corinthians. Earth's fleet, now energized by the devastation wrought upon their enemies, pressed their advantage. The Corinthian command was shattered. Their fleet was in full retreat. Torren had led them into the heart of the storm, into a battle that should have been unwinnable, and in that final, desperate act, he had turned the tide of the war. The Varian's war machine, once unstoppable, was now nothing more than a failed, crippled force, floating aimlessly in space. The Vengeance drifted in space, its hull destroyed, its crew decimated, but Torren, the architect of their survival, was alive. Barely. His final thoughts before slipping into unconsciousness were of Earth, of the people who had stood with him, of the survivors. They had won. Humanity had struck a blow that no one would forget. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. Torren had delivered that final strike, and the Corinthians would never again underestimate humanity's capacity for defiance. The aftermath of the Corinthian flagship's destruction sent shockwaves across their armada. The once proud fleet, a symbol of uncontested supremacy, had been reduced to a disoriented mass of burning wreckage. For a moment, space seemed to hold its breath, the void silent except for the drifting husks of Corinthian warships. Torren's final strike, an act of desperation and defiance, had broken the spine of the Corinthian hegemony. Without their flagship and without their coordination, the remaining Corinthian ships were vulnerable, lost in a system that had once been their hunting ground. Humanity's forces, battered but relentless, pressed forward. Earth's fleet, spurred by the victory and the knowledge that they had inflicted the first real defeat on the Corinthians, pounced on the disarrayed fleet. The remaining Corinthian ships were nothing more than targets now. They tried to regroup, but there was no leadership left to command them. The backbone of their force, the flagship, was gone, and with it their will to fight. The Zarathian war machine, which had once been feared across the galaxy, was now in retreat, scattered and leaderless. In the chaos of the Corinthian retreat, Admiral Torren watched as his fleet tightened the noose. Earth's railguns, hidden in asteroid fields and lunar craters, continued to rain destruction on the surviving Corinthian ships. Without the coordination provided by their quantum communications, the Corinthians were easy prey. The ambush was complete, and the remnants of their fleet were swiftly destroyed or captured. Yet, even as the battle subsided, a new challenge loomed. Earth's victory was not just about survival. Torren knew that in order to truly secure peace, Earth would need to defuse the power struggle that had been unleashed. The Galactic Federation, the once numeral power that had watched from the sidelines as the Corinthians ravaged the galaxy, now saw the writing on the wall. The Corinthians had collapsed, not just militarily but politically. The domino effect had already begun, with colonies and subject worlds rebelling in the wake of their fall. The Federation couldn't afford to let humanity rise as the new superpower, not when the balance of power in the galaxy had already been disrupted. They had no choice but to intervene, to negotiate. Through their diplomatic channels, the Federation sent a transmission to Earth. It was an offer. Peace terms. And yet, humanity had proven something the Federation hadn't expected, that they could be more than just survivors. They could be powerful, intelligent, and capable of shaping their own destiny. Admiral Torren knew what the Federation would ask for: reparations, disarmament, concessions that would allow them to keep humanity in check. But Torren was no fool. Humanity's power had never been about overwhelming force. It had been about adaptation, intelligence, and ingenuity. If Earth accepted the Federation's terms without offering something of their own, they would only be subjugated again, and humanity had just proven they would never accept that again. The terms of the surrender were simple but crucial: complete surrender of the Corinthian fleet in exchange for technology sharing. The Federation would get the scientific advancements Earth had gained from the Corinthians, and in return, Earth would retain its sovereignty, untouched by the Federation's influence. Torren knew this was the key to ensuring humanity's survival, not just through force, but through diplomacy. He transmitted the offer to the Federation, his voice resolute. Humanity demands peace. We will share our technology, but we will not be dictated to. We will not be slaves again. It was a bold statement, one that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago, but now, with the Corinthians in ruins and Earth standing as a new force in the galaxy, the Federation had little choice but to accept. Meanwhile, the Corinthian hegemony, once the dominant empire in the galaxy, was now reduced to a footnote in history. The collapse of their fleets, the humiliation of their commanders, and the loss of their homeworld shattered their empire beyond repair. The Zorathi Dominion, seeing the rise of humanity and the sudden shift in the balance of power, began to withdraw, taking their former allies with them. The last remnants of Corinthian military were left stranded, without leadership or hope. The galaxy had turned on its axis. Earth had won not through sheer military might, but through the very intelligence and creativity the Corinthians had so thoroughly underestimated. Humanity had turned the tables, taken a lost war and reversed it, using the very tools the enemy had once used to crush them. Torren's final words were the key: never again. It was a statement that would resonate for generations to come. In the aftermath, as humanity began rebuilding, Torren refused to claim power. His victory, while monumental, was never about personal gain. Instead, he demanded that the Federation dismantle its weapons of mass destruction, a symbol of his desire for lasting peace and his belief that war should not be the answer. It was a demand that left many in the galaxy stunned, but it was a decision that would define the future of humanity. As Earth's new fleets emerged, built with salvaged Corinthian technology, humanity stood tall, not as a conquered species, but as one that had evolved into a force to be reckoned with. They had won the war, not just by fighting back, but by showing the galaxy that they could survive, outsmart their enemies, and turn the tide of battle with intelligence and precision. On Earth, the memorials were built, not just for the soldiers who fought and died, but for the legacy of those who had refused to submit. The Kessler debris, once a symbol of Earth's destruction, was now cleared, becoming a monument to humanity's survival and strength. The galaxy would never forget the lesson humanity had taught. Humans would not be left for dead again. They had proven they could survive, fight, and lead, and now the galaxy would kneel before them, not as a species to be conquered, but as a force that would reshape the stars. Torren's voice echoed in the minds of those who had witnessed the war's end. The universe respects only strength. Now, they'll remember ours. The dust had barely settled after the final battle, but already Earth's rebuilding efforts had begun. What had once been a broken and battered world, nearly brought to its knees by the overwhelming might of the Corinthian hegemony, was now on the rise. The destruction had been immense. Cities had fallen, millions of lives had been lost, and space had been scarred by the fierce battles. But in the aftermath, humanity was determined to rebuild, stronger than before. Captain Jax Torren stood at the edge of the orbital construction yards, looking out over the expanse of space. The first wave of Earth's rebuilt fleets was taking shape. It was a sight few had thought possible. Earth's military might, forged from the very technology of their enemies. The salvaged Corinthian technology had become the cornerstone of humanity's resurgence. Railguns, plasma shields, and hyper-advanced communication systems were now in humanity's arsenal, but it wasn't just the technology that had changed. Humanity itself had changed. The Odin Initiative had prepared them for moments like this, when survival was no longer a question, but empowerment. "We've done it, sir. We're rebuilding faster than we anticipated," Lieutenant Delgado reported, her voice laced with the exhaustion of long hours. "The first shipyards are fully operational, and we've got our first new fleet coming online in a matter of weeks." Torren nodded, not saying a word. His mind was already on the next step. The rebuilding wasn't just about new ships or defenses, it was about what humanity stood for now. Earth wasn't just recovering, it was rising, and it would be heard across the galaxy. The Federation had been watching from the sidelines, unsure of how to respond. For years they had maintained their neutral stance, keeping an eye on humanity but never involving themselves directly. But with the collapse of the Corinthian hegemony and humanity's astonishing survival, the Federation was now forced to reckon with the new galactic power that Earth had become. They could no longer dismiss humanity as a fragile species. Earth had gone from victim to dominant force in a matter of weeks. The Galactic Council, once neutral in the face of humanity's plight, had begun to shift. Fear was growing. Earth's newfound strength was undeniable, but it wasn't just their technological prowess that made them dangerous. It was their ingenuity, their strategic thinking, and their ability to adapt to impossible odds. The Federation feared that the balance of power in the galaxy would change permanently. They had always considered humanity to be weak, but now they were a force to be reckoned with. Behind closed doors, discussions began. The Federation knew they couldn't continue to ignore Earth's rise. Earth's military might was transforming from a fighting force to a peacekeeping force. They were no longer a species that would simply fight for survival. They had become protectors, wielding their newfound power to maintain order. With the Corinthians gone and the galaxy left in chaos, Earth's role as the new peacekeeper became clear. As the rebuilding continued, new alliances began to form. Worlds that had once bowed to the Corinthian hegemony found new hope in humanity's triumph. Some of the former enemies of the Corinthians, those who had suffered under their rule, now saw in Earth a new ally. Their previous enemies had fallen, and the Federation was too cautious to assert its dominance over them. Earth's diplomats and military leaders traveled to these new allies, offering technological expertise and economic partnerships in exchange for strategic support. The Zorathi, who had once sided with the Corinthians in their war of conquest, now approached Earth with offers of cooperation. The rebel colonies that had fought the Corinthian oppressors saw in Earth's defeat of the hegemony a turning point, a chance to reshape the galaxy under new terms, terms where humanity's voice would not be ignored. The Federation's shift toward Earth as a strategic partner was a delicate one. No longer could they afford to stand aloof, especially with the possibility of humanity's influence spreading throughout the galaxy. But this shift came with its own set of dangers. The Federation feared that Earth's rising power might lead to new conflicts, and yet they understood that if Earth were to truly step into the galactic stage, it would be as a powerful force for peace. The Federation could either stand by and watch Earth rise, or join forces with humanity to help lead the galaxy into a new era. Torren stood before a gathering of the galaxy's new leaders, his image broadcast across the vast expanse of space. As the leader of humanity's survival, he had become an icon, the face of Earth's triumph, the symbol of resistance and intelligence. But Torren had never sought power. His heart still ached for the millions lost on Mars, for the colonies reduced to rubble, For him, the war had never been about becoming a galactic ruler. It had been about survival, and now that humanity had achieved it, he knew that their greatest challenge was yet to come. At the end of his speech, Torrun stood in front of the crowd, his words final and unwavering. "We are not conquerors, nor are we pacifists. We are peacekeepers, standing for the future. Let the galaxy know that humanity's place is not as slaves or pawns in the hands of others, but as leaders, protectors, and equals." The crowd erupted in applause, but Torrun wasn't listening. His thoughts were already on what lay ahead. How to balance the immense power humanity now possessed, and how to ensure peace in a galaxy that had long been at war. Humanity's legacy was no longer just about surviving the war. It was about forging a new path for the future, a future where Earth could lead, but also guide. The Odin Initiative, now fully realized, was not just a weapon, but a tool for peace, a technology to prevent war, not provoke it. Humanity's greatest victory was not defeating the Corinthians, but showing the galaxy that humanity didn't need to fight on equal terms. They didn't need to be like their enemies. They just needed to outsmart them. As Earth's new fleets took shape, so did the future of the galaxy. Earth, once thought weak and fragile, was now a force that would reshape the stars. The galaxy would no longer look at humanity as a naive species on the fringes of the universe. They would kneel before Earth, knowing that humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through brute force, but through intelligence, adaptation, and the drive to never be left for dead again. The message was clear. Humanity was here to stay, and they would not be forgotten. The galaxy trembled in the wake of Earth's unexpected victory over the Corinthian hegemony. What had once been a relatively insignificant species, barely able to hold its own against the great galactic empires, now stood at the center of the galaxy's shifting power dynamics. No longer would humanity be dismissed as a fragile species. Earth's bravery, its strategy, and its victory had proven that humanity was a force that could not only survive, but could reshape the galaxy itself. Within weeks of Corinth Prime's destruction, whispers spread like wildfire through the galaxy. Zarathi defectors, those who had once served the Corinthians as allies, now found themselves turning their allegiance toward Earth. The realization was dawning on the galaxy. Humanity wasn't just a species to be eradicated. They were a species capable of outwitting their enemies and seizing victory from the jaws of defeat. The first defection came from Zarathi generals. They were the ones who had once sided with the Corinthians in the War of Conquest, and many had been disillusioned by the fall of their ally. The Zarathi, while formidable in combat, had always relied on their superior military technology. But now they saw that the Corinthian arrogance had been their downfall. Earth had outsmarted the seemingly invincible enemy, and the Zarathi leaders began to see in humanity's success the possibility of their own rebirth. A chance to distance themselves from the Corinthian collapse and align themselves with the new galactic order. But it wasn't just the Zarathi who were considering Earth's rise. Across the outer rims, in the fringe systems, pirate factions who had once raided humanity's supply lines now found themselves re-evaluating their allegiances. They had always dismissed Earth as weak, easy prey for their raids. But in the wake of humanity's resounding victory, many of these pirates saw an opportunity to join the winners rather than continue to fight them. These outlaw factions were no longer outcasts. They were potential allies. They broke the Corinthians. The words spread from mouth to mouth, and for the first time in decades, humanity was seen as more than a victim. It was the galactic wildcard, capable of disrupting the long-standing powers that had ruled the stars. Earth was no longer just fighting for survival. It was beginning to assert its place among the stars. Admiral Jax Torrun stood at the center of this transformation. His victory had not only earned him the title of humanity's greatest hero, but had also made him the central figure in galactic diplomacy. As Earth began to broker new trade deals with its former enemies, Torrun found himself at the helm of a shifting galactic balance. Even the Federation, once so reluctant to involve itself in humanity's fate, began to view Earth as a strategic partner. Humanity, though still scarred from its losses, had become the galactic wildcard. The species capable of turning the tide with its intelligence, adaptability, and unconventional warfare. The new alliances were not only born of necessity, but of a shared vision. A future where the old powers of the galaxy could no longer reign unchecked. Earth's rise had ignited the spark of rebellion across countless systems. Formerly oppressed worlds, those that had been crushed under the weight of the Corinthian hegemony, now saw humanity's victory as a symbol of what was possible. If humanity could rise from the ashes of near extinction, why couldn't they? One by one, these worlds reached out to Earth. Diplomatic envoys began arriving at Lunar Station, bringing with them proposals for alliances, trade agreements, and even military pacts. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer just a power to be feared. It was a power to align with, to work alongside in reshaping the galaxy's future. Torren, however, had never been interested in taking up the mantle of Galactic Emperor. His refusal of power was a deliberate choice. Humanity's place among the stars, he knew, was not in conquering the galaxy, but in leading it into a new era. An era where power was no longer about brute force, but about intelligence, alliances, and diplomacy. Yet, the galaxy's reaction was undeniable. The Federation, fearful of the growing influence of Earth, still struggled to come to terms with the shift. They knew their neutrality had been a convenient position in the past, but now they faced a very different reality. Earth was no longer just a member of the galactic family, it was a key player, one whose military might and technological innovations could no longer be ignored. The pirate fleets that had once preyed on Earth's shipping routes now rallied behind the banner of humanity, realizing that their future lay in cooperation rather than rebellion. Many had once seen the Corinthian hegemony as an ally, but now the hegemony was gone. They recognized that Earth was the power to be reckoned with. In the quiet moments of diplomacy, when Torren found himself at the negotiating table, he reflected on how far humanity had come. The galaxy, once so vast and unfathomable, had become a place where humanity's voice was being heard, where the underdogs had risen from the ashes and taken their place at the table. Torren's final words to the galaxy had been simple, but they would echo through history. We don't fight on equal terms. We fight to win. And now, they'll remember us. And so, Earth's future was no longer just about survival. It was about leadership, about shaping a galaxy where the mistakes of the past were not repeated. Humanity was no longer seen as the weak species that had once been left for dead. Now, it was a force of calculated power, a strategic partner, and a guardian of peace across the stars. The last remnants of the Zarathi dominion had been shattered. Once a dominant force across the galaxy, the Zarathi now found themselves scattered and disorganized. Their once proud fleets, crushed by the might of Earth's newly risen forces, were little more than a shadow of their former selves. The core systems of the Zarathi Empire had fallen into chaos. Their subject worlds rising in rebellion, what remained of their military might had scattered into the dark corners of the galaxy, unsure of their future. The galactic balance had shifted irreversibly. The galaxy that had once been ruled by the strong and the brutal now found itself facing a new reality. Humanity was no longer an afterthought, no longer dismissed as weak or insignificant. Earth had gone from a victim of galactic conquest to one of its most formidable powers. Humanity's resilience, ingenuity, and ability to adapt had not only saved them but had propelled them to the forefront of galactic affairs. Admiral Jax Torren stood at the helm of this new order. The war had ended, but the work had just begun. The galaxy was no longer divided by old loyalties and old powers. Humanity had woven itself into the very fabric of galactic politics, and its new role was undeniable. Earth had built itself into a peacekeeping force, using its technological advancements and newly forged alliances to maintain balance where once there was only chaos. As Torren stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking out at the vast expanse of stars, he could feel the weight of it all. Humanity was no longer on the fringes, fighting for survival. They were the new center of the galaxy. The galaxy respected them and feared them. They had earned their place, not through brute strength, but through intelligence, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to survival. The Federation, once hesitant to involve itself in Earth's affairs, now saw humanity as a strategic ally. The diplomatic ties between Earth and the galaxy's other factions had solidified, and Earth's growing influence became a pivotal force in shaping galactic politics. Former enemies of the Zarathi, now allies to Earth, rallied together, forming a coalition of species united under the banner of a new era. An era where peace was not dictated by strength alone, but by a balance of power and shared responsibility. The galaxy watched with a mixture of awe and wariness as humanity set its course. What had once seemed impossible, Earth's survival, its rise to dominance, had now become a defining moment in galactic history. Humanity, the species that had been left for dead, had proven itself to be the ultimate survivor. And now the galaxy knew that humanity would never be forgotten. Torren's final message, broadcast across the stars, echoed in the minds of all who heard it. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration, a promise. Never again will we be left for dead. In that single sentence, Torren encapsulated the spirit of humanity. They had endured, they had overcome, and now they would lead. The message was clear. Earth was no longer a footnote in galactic history. Humanity was not just a force to be reckoned with, it was the force that would guide the future. Their legacy was one of strength, resilience, and an unyielding will to survive and prosper, no matter the odds. Earth's new role in the galaxy was undeniable. Its fleets, now composed of the most advanced technologies, were the most feared peacekeepers in the galaxy. The Odin Initiative, once a secret project, was now humanity's greatest asset, both a shield and a sword, ensuring that humanity's place at the table would never be challenged again. As Torren addressed the galactic leaders, his voice calm but resolute, it was clear that the galaxy would never be the same. We do not seek dominance. We seek peace. We seek justice. But we will not be intimidated, and we will not allow anyone to dictate our future. Humanity had come a long way from the brink of extinction, and the future was no longer uncertain. They had proven that even when faced with overwhelming odds, they could rise, adapt, and ultimately conquer. The galaxy, now united under a new order, had learned this valuable lesson. Never again would humanity be underestimated. As Earth's fleets moved forward into the stars, leading the charge into a new era of galactic peace, the stars no longer felt so distant. Humanity's place in the galaxy had been secured. They had survived, and now they would lead. What do you think humanity's future will look like now that they've secured their place among the stars? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories.